science and religion are just best buds, and the Bible is clearly accurate in anything scientific. Am I right?
Well, of course, that's been the tradition that we have been knowing and growing up and have been completely accepting through media for the last several thousand years. No reason to question that. Okay. There is obviously also the narrative that they are completely at loggerheads, and every single time they ever come together, it's just absolute chaos. It's constantly Yahweh versus Leviathan every single time, every single take. And Yahweh doesn't always win, Leviathan doesn't always win. But that's not the reality either. There are too many examples of scientists who are extremely good scientists, but also are religious. And of course, there are plenty of examples of people who aren't theistic at all, but still believe all sorts of crazy stuff that's against the science anyways. So it's not any perfect thing there. And frankly, also, most of the stuff that scientists say or do doesn't really have any religious implications per se. When scientists figured out that water is constituent of 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, it wasn't a heresy. It wasn't even something to register. It's only in very particular cases where there might even potentially be a conflict. And often a religious person will even say that religion doesn't have anything to say about some scientific topic anyways. We're talking about completely different subject matter. We're talking about what will happen in the afterlife. How does salvation work? What is good or bad, in which allegedly science doesn't have anything to say about or inform us about in any deeper sense. Science might tell us that if I do shoot the person, here's how quickly they'll bleed out, but it won't tell me it was wrong to shoot out the person. Somehow religion will provide the answers to that. So with that sort of preamble, I also want to push back against the idea that there isn't actually any conflict, because that seems to also come up a lot in the recent scholarship, trying to argue that all the cases of conflict between science and religion were not necessary, that there isn't any necessary points of conflict, and where they've happened has just been kind of these weird political phenomena. So like when we look at, say, young earth creationists, in many ways, they're a weird recent phenomenon. If you went back to the year 1900, we're about 40-ish years after Darwin publishes his big book on evolution, we're well after the time of George Lyell about deep time, most educated Christians didn't really see any issue with the antiquity of the earth, the common ancestry of creatures. They might have said something special about humans, but there was a lot of general acceptance of that. The explosion of young earth creationism has been, in many ways, a strange and very American phenomenon. And so it would be unwise to say, because there are young earth creationists, religion is always at loggerheads. It's this weird political modernist machination. And in many ways, it's kind of the root of a larger problem that people are having with modernism. Now, then you have to ask the question, well, why was religion having a problem with modernism? The big issue that, especially in the US, was happening, much bigger than the evolution issue, was about higher criticism of the Bible. When the first theologian coming to Union Theological Seminary in New York, he had gotten himself well educated in the higher criticism from the German schools, came back to the US and said, you know what, that whole Genesis story thing is kind of myth. And the stories about Jesus are also highly exaggerated, things like that. This caused a huge firestorm, and nearly got the guy permanently excommunicated from the Presbyterian Church. And well, what was the problem there? It was a much more scientific approach to the text. It wasn't the acceptance of the story as being told. Now, as time has gone on, more and more often the theologians will say, well, we now accept that, that Genesis is, a product of its time, with the mythological trappings and cosmological trappings of the time it was written in, very, very roughly the 5th, 6th century BC, when it was, finally compiled together after the exile. And I'm saying very, very approximately because I have no real sense of how much antiquity the various stories had or how much editing happened after the exile. That's well beyond my pay grade right now. But the expert consensus that it's after the Babylonian exile that Genesis gets together in the form we generally know it in Hebraic form. So you'd say it's a product of that time, and so the fact that it doesn't match with our sensibilities of how to explain things, well, that just, because shows as a product of the time. But again, it is the case that time it comes from is also filled with all sorts of superstitions that we also say is completely anti-scientific. If someone was to come and say, I'm a worshiper of Ishtar and I praise the morning star when it rises because I am trying to have a more fertile harvest, or have a better time with my wife because she's a love goddess, we would say, okay, that's just really weird anti-scientific thinking. We actually know how fertility works. We actually know that that's just a star in the sky. It's like, well, we don't seem to then allow ourselves that same level of interpretive flexibility if someone was a modern, believing those old things. So why would someone believing the Hebrew scriptures and saying it has some sort of great import also not get away with those sort of problems? So that's one thought. And the simple fact of the matter is, if we are trying to say that the messages of the Bible are coming from this great transcendent source, why is he forced to communicate with humans, not in simply a limited way? I can understand that God can't completely reveal himself if he's completely incomprehensible to humans in his true form. But why does he have to explain himself or his message in ways that we know are wrong on their face of it? And we also have to note, when we say are wrong on the face of it, given our current knowledge, when the Old Testament talks about the earth being held up on pillars, or the heavens being held up on pillars, that wasn't a metaphor to the person writing the book of Job or Genesis or any of the other Old Testament texts. That was literally how people thought things were. So if God is saying this, but it's a metaphor, who knew it was a metaphor back then? We would call that then very bad communication. So if you are trying to read it metaphorically, are you actually undermining what the original intentions of those original authors were? Because one way or another, the actual authors were the ones who actually held the pen or the stylus, whichever way that they were writing it at that time. If we are going to try to treat the Bible as human literature, then science is coming in and saying, all right, then we have to treat it as the way literature is normally produced. And how is literature normally produced? Not with a bunch of angels and demons whispering into our ears. It's the machinations of what humans do. So that's already a point where I see us saying, if we're applying scientific thinking to the Bible, it is forcing religion to change to match with that. If that weren't the case, then I don't think there would have been any major consternations about higher criticism of the Bible. But that's been the history. When David Strauss in the 1830s publishes his giant book on the life of Jesus, critically examined, and he uses the M word for Jesus and the stories of Jesus, mythos. He lost his job, he was hounded, he was attacked, and that was because he was undermining what was so widely believed. And I don't think if you went back 1,000 years or 1,500 years, you would have found other theologians saying, oh yeah, the stories we believe about Jesus, yeah, that's just, nice, useful fiction. No, they really believed, that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. He himself rose from the dead. He, cured the sick and the lame, and he's going to come back on a cloud with, glory and, with, the entire angelic forces. It's only because those beliefs have forced to change are we now saying there's no conflict, which is another way of saying science and religion fought, science won, and the boundaries were redrawn. To say that there's now not a conflict on that point after the boundaries have been redrawn is a weird thing to say. Like right now, we got the war going on in Russia and Ukraine. If at the end of that, Russia takes territory from Ukraine at the end, are we going to say now the two countries were always at peace? I'm sorry, if you aren't paying attention to history then. Just because the current borders they're not shooting over anymore doesn't mean 5 minutes ago they were, or they might start shooting again.
I'm thinking about what you said, and there seems to be a current battle, not literal, but in a sense literal. And what I mean is apologists online are battling the critical scholars that are out here pointing out flaws and errors and contradictions and manuscript differences and did Luke Acts really even know who Paul was? Were they really traveling companions when they're so different? Oh no, they're not so different. And of course, they're trying, I think, to hold on to the last few threads of the Bible being factual, historical, reliable, eyewitness testimonies, the whole nine. And we see this battle happening. But it seems science and critical method and things like that are winning the day. Where do you see things going with this? Do you think it's just, Do you think everybody eventually is going to finally get it? Or is there always going to be a stronghold for people who are just not going to accept because the data is not good enough? Maybe the New Testament is so open to interpretation or flexible, people can run off with whatever they want if they want it bad enough.
One way or another, there definitely will be change. And you will still have the diehards who will say, you know, every jot and tittle is 100% true, even the parts that contradict the other parts. They're both completely 100% true. But the majority of people are going to move, or they just were never interested in the topic in the first place. And so most of this stuff might be just arguments happening in the ivory towers, and they're just basically, you know, going in for their worship services, and they're not, you know, getting into the nitty gritty and worrying about, you know, which textual tradition for Acts are we going to be following? Should we be following the Western textual tradition, or should we be looking at these other Byzantine texts? It's like, these aren't questions that the average person even knows about, let alone, you know, gives a hoot about, unless they happen to have a pastor who just, you know, thumps on the stand and say only the King James version because that's the version Jesus spoke. You know, beyond those exceptions, you know, for most people, the topic is, you know, as the term is, academic. Now, the question is, where is academia going to go? Again, if I, you know, shoot back 200 years, it was going to be pretty rare to find a theologian that was seriously questioning the historicity of most of the stories of the Old and New Testament. You know, they might have said there's some weird things here and there, like, you know, how did Moses write about his own death? But then they'll just explain it, well, Joshua wrote that small part. But the rest is completely written by Moses. And that was acceptable for the longest time until, you know, people kept poking and prodding and things weren't adding up. And it's like, well, you know, how is it that they're like Noah is following the laws of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before, you know, they're told about these sorts of things, all these little details. Or especially once you have more deistic people coming in. And really what I've seen in the history, and I've been seeing this more as I've been studying the history of explanations of the Star of Bethlehem story, when the deists started coming in and started saying, hey, all that miracle stuff has to go, and look at all these miracle stories you have in the Bible, that's when like a lot of hay is being thrown, a lot of argumentation, a lot of vitriol is flying, because there was now that new conflict between the clockwork universe that was provided by the workings of Newton's physics applied to the world, and you look at Newton's physics, hey, it explains the whole world, and explains it like basically a giant machine. You know, that's why it's called like the clockwork or mechanical universe. It's just basically gears grinding away to get the results we have. It works so beautifully for the solar system and astronomy. It seemed to also be working well when you fire cannonballs. You know exactly where you're going to land by using the exact same physics that explains why Mars goes around the sun, etc. Well, if that's how the universe seems to work, and God isn't doing any part of it, then what's going on with all these stories where God is coming in and, you know, really messing with the mechanics that doesn't seem to actually cohere with how things really seem to work? So that was like the challenge that deists were coming in. And at first the response for that was, well, first God does miracles. That's one response. But if you're a theologian who basically accepts the physics of the time, okay, God doesn't do miracles. So these stories that look miraculous, you've just misinterpreted what's going on, or the disciples themselves were just, you know, pre-scientific thinkers, so they misinterpreted natural phenomena. The most fun one from Heinrich Paulus. He's writing in the 1830s, and he's basically the epitome of all those previous works. And he, when I've gone back to read him and cite all the things that he is coming from like the last 50 years of research on these things, he has the idea that, like, well, for example, the story of Jesus walking on water, here's what really happened. It was a dark and stormy night. The disciples were on their boat and they got completely lost in the fog. They didn't even realize that they actually had crashed into the shore and were stuck there. They thought they were still on the middle of the Sea of Galilee. So when Jesus comes walking up in the morning, when the storm is finally calmed and he is on the beach shore, they think they're on the middle of the water, like, our Lord, he's walking on water. It was just a total mistake. You guys. And now just imagine that process for every single miracle of the New Testament, including the resurrection. Like the swoon hypothesis that Jesus survived the crucifixion, that was originally an apologetic to save Christianity, not a atheistic attack. Strangely enough, even though it's now completely reversed its usages now. But then eventually, David Friedrich Strauss comes along and basically says, hey, those things don't actually match the story. The miracles don't even actually make much sense when you really think about it. And it's like, realize, well, if we actually compare this to other literature at the time or biblical tropes, and you realize, this is just storytelling. This is how people, spin a yarn. And then, of course, finally, people now accept that that's what's going on, at least for the most part, for the Bible. There are questions, well, where are the kernels of truth? And people come to different conclusions there. I come to there being almost no corn in the gospel accounts, but that might be to say for a separate session.
Thank you.